Hey everybody, this is the introduction to Julia Lavelle's book, Maoism, A Global History. The chapters of this book are What is Maoism? The Red Star Revolution by the book, The Brainwashed China and the World in the 1950s, World Revolution, Years of Living Dangerously, The Indonesian Connection, Into Africa, Mao's Dominoes, Vietnam and Cambodia, quote, You are old, we are young, Mao Zedong, end quote. Maoism in the United States and Western Europe, Red Sun over Peru, The Shining Path, China's chairman is our chairman, Maoism in India, Nepal, Maoism in Power, 12, Mao-ish China. Conclusion. Okay, so let's go. Beijing, autumn 1936. A spacious courtyard house, the residence of the American journalists Helen and Edgar Snow. Helen, in her late 20s, boyishly slim, Hollywood good looks, settles down to a morning's writing. The front door opens. Edgar enters. She has not seen her husband for 4 months. Since June, he has been almost incommunicado on a trip to the Chinese Communist state in the Northwest. He is in Helen's characteristically sharp description, quote, grinning foolishly behind a grizzled beard and looking like the cat that had swallowed the canary, end quote. Dancing jubilantly around the room in a, quote, gray cap and with a red star on its faded front, and coat, he ordered from their Chinese cook a hearty American breakfast, eggs, coffee, milk. Edgar Snow's bag is laden with notebooks, photographic films, and the text of 20,000 of Mao's transcribed words. Over the coming months, Edgar Snow will write up this material into a book he calls Red Star Over China. It will become a world bestseller. Red Star will not only determine Snow's career as a chronicler of the Chinese Communist Revolution and as a mediator between the Chinese Communists and international audiences, but will also turn Mao into a political celebrity. The book will translate Mao and his revolution to Indian nationalists, Chinese intellectuals, Soviet partisans, American presidents, Malayan insurgents, anti-apartheid fighters, Western radicals, Nepali rebels, and many others. The book, Red Star Over China, is the beginning of global Maoism. The Jungle in Perak, Malaya, 1940s. Soldiers in the British colonial army, British, Malay, Australian, Gurkhas, pick over the remnants of abandoned Malayan Communist Party camps. They find dozens of copies of Edgar Snow's Red Star in its Chinese translation. In 1948, the Malayan Communist Party, dominated by ethnic Chinese, has launched an anti-British insurgency that Malaya's colonial rulers have dubbed the, quote, emergency. It is one of the earliest decolonizing rebellions against the old European empires in the wake of the Second World War. Mao and his revolution are inspirational to these rebels for his devotion to protracted guerrilla warfare, for his creation of a tightly indoctrinated party and army, and for his defiance of European, American, and Japanese imperialism. Washington, November 1950. Cold War jitters in the State Department building. News of Chinese Communist intervention in the Korean War is confirmed. Fears of global Maoist insurrection breed. Senator Joe McCarthy, quote, the great national intimidator, end quote, rides high on popular panic about communist infiltration of the United States, ousting 2 liberal senators through accusations of, quote, red associations. For America's leaders, the Malayan emergency is part of the Cold War, not an anti-colonial struggle. Its root cause is declared to be transnational Chinese subversion, and it must be defeated to prevent the global victory of communism. The, quote, domino theory, the idea that without U.S. intervention, the territories of Southeast Asia will one by one fall to Chinese communism, is born. As the Korean War turns for the worse that winter and some 7,000 GIs are captured when human waves of Chinese soldiers push through their lines and onto Seoul, America is gripped by stories of a new-style Maoist party Psy-war trialed on its POWs in Korea. An American journalist and perhaps sometime CIA agent called Edward Hunter publishes allegations of Mao's terrifying new weapon against humanity, quote, brainwashing. CIA officers, journalists, behavioral scientists, novelists, and filmmakers will collude through the 1950s to imagine a powerful machinery of Maoist thought control. The dread of Chinese, quote, brainwashing, building on pre-existing terror of Soviet mind manipulations, will balloon America's, quote, covert sphere, end quote, justifying the existence of a secret state within the state and the CIA's vast psychological operations program. Through a series of codenamed initiatives in the 1950s and 1960s, Bluebird, Artichoke, MK Ultra, the CIA will seek to reverse engineer the Soviet and Chinese techniques of mind control it is deemed so dangerous. Eventually, this project will morph into the, quote, enhanced interrogations, end quote, of the present war on terror, undermining the foundations of U.S. democracy. The Bronx, New York, 1969. A young American radical called Dennis O'Neill has a contretemps from a friend. Or contretemps? I don't know. Like many of his generation, O'Neill is a passionate admirer of Mao Zedong and of his Cultural Revolution. His friend favors Trotsky. They devise a scientific trial to settle whose political strategy is superior. For a set period of time every day, they will each read from their idol's secret works to different marijuana plants on the balcony of their 14th floor apartment. Quote, my plant flourished and his withered, end quote. O'Neill later remembers. Quote, proof positive, end quote. Meanwhile, in a San Francisco bookstore called China Books and Periodicals, the West Coast main outlet for Mao's words, further eccentricity plays out. Amid the stacks of little red books, a group of self-styled, quote, ultra-democrats, end quote, called the Seven Diggers sit in the lotus position. Their energy is sustained by cannabis-infused brownies, reading Mao and the Chinese Revolution and guerrilla warfare. A pair of trenchcoats FBI officers browse Chinese postage stamps to one side of the store as they monitor the situation. The CIA's experiments with LSD and devising their own mind control program play a key part in the drug-fueled youth rebellions of the 1960s and 1970s. By 1969, the quantities of LSD in CIA-funded research labs and universities have leaked into recreational use by students. The burgeoning drug scene helps unleash a noisy protest culture which identifies with the Cultural Revolution. Maoish hippiedom, instanced on Dennis O'Neill's balcony and in Seven Diggers' seances, results. Mao fever spreads across the West. Quote, big character posters, end quote, are pasted over French campuses. Mao badges are printed on West German student lapels. Little red book quotations are daubed on walls of Italian lecture halls. Maoist anarchists scramble to the top of a church in West Berlin and bombard passers-by with hundreds of little red books. But there are toughs as well as flakes. Aspiring revolutionaries travel to China or Albania for political and military training, designed and funded by the People's Republic of China. After 1968, the militancy of Cultural Revolution Maoism inspires the urban terrorism of West Germany's Red Army faction and the Red Brigades in Italy that attacks these fragile European democracies struggling for legitimacy in the wake of fascism. Nanjing, 1965. As enthusiasm for Mao's revolution sweeps global left-wing politics, a Peruvian professor of philosophy attends a military training school in Nanjing. It is later speculated that here he met Soloth Sar, subsequently Pol Pot, architect of the Khmer Rouge genocide in Cambodia, who also attends classes that year at Beijing's Ha Phaila Pai Shun Zhongshin, the Asian, African, and Latin American Training Center just outside the marble precincts of the Imperial Summer Palace. For revolutionaries from those regions. Quote, we picked up a pen, end quote. Abimael Guzmán says later, remembering an explosives training class, quote, and it blew up and we took a seat, it blew up too. And when we took a seat, it blew up too. It was a kind of general fireworks display, ... perfectly calculated to show us that anything could be blown up if you figure out how to do it. ... That school contributed greatly to my development and helped me begin to gain an appreciation for Chairman Mao Zedong, end quote. In 1979, as leader of the Communist Party of Peru's Shining Path, Guzmán embarks on his Maoist People's War, a brutal campaign that over the next 2 decades will claim some 70,000 lives and cost Peru some £10 billion worth of economic damage. After 12 years of protracted guerrilla war, Guzmán, as a final Maoist flourish, sets as the date for his ultimate power-seizing offensive the 99th anniversary of Mao's birthday, 26th of December 1992. The revolution he forecasts will cost a, quote, million deaths, end quote. Some predict that if the Shining Path's revolution succeeds, a realistic prospect in the early 1990s Peru, its aftermath will generate bloodshed dwarfing that perpetrated by the Khmer Rouge. In addition to Pol Pot, Guzmán may have encountered another aspiring revolutionary while in Nanjing, a towering, intense, serious southern Rhodesian, whose close-cropped hair and green eyes, deep-set in light brown, pockmarked face, called Josiah Tongogara. He is usually sunk in thought about the liberation of southern Rhodesia from white rule. If pushed to make small talk, he discourses only on his willingness to die, quote, through the barrel of a gun, and quote, in fact, he will die in an ill-judged overtaking maneuver on a highway. As with Guzmán, Tongogara's time in China makes a dedicated Maoist of him. At the Nanjing Military Academy, he comes to worship the Chinese as, quote, mentors in morality as well as in military skills and strategies, end quote. In the late 1960s, Tongogara, I can't pronounce this person's name, Tongogara, returns to the southern Rhodesian border where the Zimbabwean African National Liberation Army, ZANLA, the armed wing of the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Union, ZANU, is preparing for its guerrilla war against southern Rhodesia. He abandons ZANLA's old, failing hit-and-run tactics and remakes the army struggle into along patient, protracted Maoist lines. He translates Mao into Shona. His guerrilla troops must depend on the people as Simba, Rehove, Riri, Mumvura, as a fish has its strength in water. Meanwhile, Chinese instructors train ZANLA recruits in nearby Tanzania. In the late 1970s, 5,000 cadets are schooled for an offensive dubbed Sasa Tuna Malitsa. Now we are finishing. Exhausted by the ZANU's resistance, the white rulers of southern Rhodesia are forced to negotiate. As a child, Tongogara, odd-jawed by retrieving tennis balls dropped by a young white boy called Ian Smith. In 1979, as ZANLA's representative at the peace talks, he shares coffee breaks with Smith, now Prime Minister of the white-majority Southern Rhodesian government, at Lancaster House in London. Deep in central India's jungles today, Naxalite guerrillas in olive fatigues and bright saris dance in lines before a photograph of Chairman Mao and declare war on the government's, quote, uniformed goons, and quote, who have confiscated local land for its precious bauxite reserves. In these beautiful, brutal jungles, the still militant Indian Maoist movement traces its origins back to its Cultural Revolution-inspired incarnation in 1967, when its leaders were also in Beijing alongside men like Guzmán and Tongogara. In 2006, India's rulers considered this Maoist insurgency the, quote, biggest internal security threat to the Indian state, end quote. While intellectuals in New Delhi argue about whether the insurgents are tribal terrorists led by high caste manipulators or desperate rebels with a cause, Maoists and police engage in reciprocal murdering sprees. One week, a dozen police are slaughtered by Maoist landmines. The next, the police rape and kill civilians with alleged Maoist connections. Unlike the Maoist rebels in Nepal, who in 2006 abandoned their insurgency to participate in parliamentary democracy, the Indian comrades are stalwarts of purist Maoist doctrine and refuse to take part in elections. The Naxalites give Arundhati Roy, one of India's most famous writers and public intellectuals, exclusive access to their story, escorting her around their secret camps. On her return to literary Delhi, she publishes articles praising their simple, vibrant, and comradely culture. Is Roy a romantic intellectual in love with the ferocious revolutionary ideal that would, to paraphrase Nabokov on earlier foreign admirers of Soviet Russia, destroy her, quote, as naturally as rabbits are by ferrets and farmers, end quote, if it were to win control of India? Or has she actually highlighted the appeal of anarchic Maoist liberation to a persecuted underclass left no alternative by a brutal, corrupt government? In Chongqing, a metropolis on the banks of the Yangtze River that is officially, quote, China's happiest city, end quote, thousands of identical scarlet-shirted civilians gather in a public square to sing and dance Maoist hymns. Quote, without the Communist Party, there would be no new China, end quote. Quote, heaven and earth are small compared to the party's benevolence, end quote. Quote, the Communist Party is wonderful, the Communist Party is wonderful, the Communist Party is wonderful, end quote. Stories abound in the press about the miraculously therapeutic properties of these anthems, about a woman who has recovered from crippling depression through listening, about the psychiatric patients whose symptoms, quote, suddenly disappeared, end quote, after they joined revolutionary choirs, of the prisoners cured of their criminality by singing, quote, red songs. Students are sent down to the countryside to learn from the peasants. Solemn-looking party cadres don shapeless blue Maoist uniforms and travel to a mountainous, isolated corner of southeast China, quote, to deepen their understanding and experience, end quote, of the revolution and generally improve their, quote, red morals, end quote. Quote, there are some abominably sour and smelly literati around at the moment, end quote, a People's Liberation Army elder observes, as critics of the regime disappear without a trace into communist prisons. Quote, they attack Chairman Mao and practice de-Maoification. We must fight to repel this reactionary countercurrent, end quote. A young man petitions the government to prosecute writers who voice criticism of the great helmsman and demands that neighborhoods report to the police anyone suspected of disloyalty to the chairman. This is not 1966, the year in which Mao started his Cultural Revolution, the high point of his utopian fever that unleashed bands of Red Guards onto the streets of China's cities, that dislocated millions of educated urbanites to remote rural areas, and that left at least 1.5 million dead, following on from the 30 million death toll of the man-made famine of the early 1960s. This is 2011. And that is why these songs can also be heard in karaoke bars, why Chinese mobile phones, 13 million at a time, are being bombarded by Mao quotation text, why Mao's message can target audiences through TV schedules dominated by classic revolutionary films, and why the government has launched, quote, Red Twitter, delivering gobbets of laconic 1960s wisdom via a very 21st century micromedium. Bo Xilai, architect of this neo-Maoist revival, is purged in spring of 2012 for corruption and for his wife's poisoning of an old Horovian called Neil Haywood. Yet Xi Jinping, who becomes party secretary in November 2012, inherits and implements Bo's neo-Maoism on a national stage. In the first few months after he comes to power, Xi launches a, quote, mass line, one of Mao's favorite catchphrases, website, to crack down on corruption and boost links between the Communist Party and the grassroots, and reintroduces Mao-style, quote, criticism and self-criticism, end quote, throughout the state bureaucracy. For the first time since the death of Mao in 1976, Xi Jinping has rehabilitated Maoist strategies into China's national public culture. These 8 scenarios, ranging from the 1930s to the present and across Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas, suggest the chronological and geographic scope of Maoism, one of the most significant and complicated political forces of the modern world. A potent mix of party-building, discipline, anti-colonial rebellion, and, quote, continuous revolution, and, quote, grafted onto the secular religion of Soviet Marxism. Maoism not only unlocks the contemporary history of China, but is also a key influence on global insurgency, insubordination, and intolerance across the last 80 years. But beyond China, and especially in the West, the global spread and importance of Mao and his ideas in the contemporary history of radicalism are only dimly sensed, if at all. They have been effaced by the end of the Cold War, the apparent global victory of neoliberal capitalism, and the resurgence of religious extremism. This book aims to bring Mao and his ideas out of the shadows and recast Maoism as one of the major stories of the 20th and 21st centuries. In 1935, Mao maneuvered his way into a position of leadership in the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. At the time, the authority was arguably not worth having. That year, around 8,000 exhausted revolutionaries on the run from encirclement and annihilation campaigns directed by the ruling Nationalist Party tramped into Yan'an, a small, impoverished town dug out of the hillsides of northwest China. But within 10 years, a decade that saw the country scourged variously by floods, famine, and Japanese invasion, Communist Party membership had surged to 1.2 million and its armies increased to more than 900,000. After another 4 years, the Chinese Communists under Mao Zedong had expelled their rivals for China, the Nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, from the mainland and on to Taiwan. Since its founding in 1949, the PRC has somehow managed to survive longer than any of the revolutionary regimes that preceded it in China. Despite the convulsions of a vast man-made famine and a civil war, the Cultural Revolution that cost and disrupted the lives of tens of millions of Chinese people. Today, PRC is held together by the legacies of Maoism. Although the Chinese Communist Party has long abandoned the utopian turmoil of Maoism in favor of an authoritarian capitalism that prizes prosperity and stability, the great helmsman has left a heavy mark on politics and society. Mao's portrait, 6 by 4.5 meters, still hangs in Tiananmen Square, the heartland of Chinese political power, in the center of the capital. In the middle of the square, his waxen embalmed body still lies in state, like a sleeping beauty waiting the kiss of history to bring him back to life. Quote, Mao's invisible hand, end quote, as one recent book puts it, remains omnipresent in China's polity, in the deep politicization of its judiciary, the supremacy of the one-party state over all other interests, the fundamental intolerance of dissident voices. Maoism is a body of contradictory ideas that has distinguished itself from earlier guises of Marxism in several important ways. Giving center stage to a non-Western anti-colonial agenda, Mao declared to radicals in developing countries that Russian-style communism should be adapted to local national conditions, and that the Soviet Union could go wrong. Diverging from Stalin, Mao told revolutionaries to take their struggle out of the cities and deep into the countryside. Although, like Lenin and Stalin, Mao is determined to build a one-party state with military discipline. He also, especially in his last decade, championed an anarchic democracy, telling the Chinese people that, quote, rebellion is justified, end quote, and that when, quote, there is great chaos under heaven, the situation is excellent, end quote. Mao preached the doctrine of voluntarism, that by sheer audacity of belief the Chinese and any other people with the necessary strength of will could transform their country. Revolutionary zeal, not weaponry, was the decisive factor. Perhaps most innovatively of all, Mao declared that, quote, women can hold up half the sky, end quote. Although his own womanizing practice fell far short of his rhetoric, none of his global peers voiced such an egalitarian agenda. Born of an era in which China was held in contempt by the international system, Mao assembled a practical and theoretical toolkit for turning a fractious, failing empire into a defiant global power. Mao created a language that intellectuals, peasants, men and women could understand, a system of propaganda and thought control that has been described as, quote, one of the most ambitious attempts at human manipulation in history, end quote. A disciplined army, and he gathered round him a company of unusually talented, ruthless comrades. His ideas elicited extraordinary levels of fervor. Millions entered into marriages of political convenience and abandoned their children to devote themselves to a utopian experiment. These children in turn denounced, humiliated, and in extreme cases killed their parents in the 1960s and 1970s in the name of their great helmsman. My first chapter will explore the definitions of Maoism, a term that has been used both admiringly and pejoratively for several decades to signify a spectrum of political behavior, ranging from anarchic mass democracy to Machiavellian brutality against political enemies. The terms, quote, Maoist and, quote, Maoism gained currency in U.S. Cold War analyses of China intended to categorize and stereotype a, quote, red China that was the essence of alien threat. After Mao's death, they became catch-all words for dismissing what was perceived as the unitary repressive madness of China from 1949 to 1976. Here the term is not understood in this petrified form. Quote, Maoism in this book is an umbrella word for the wide range of theory and practice attributed to Mao and his influence over the past 80 years. In other words, this term is useful only if we accept that the ideas and experiences it describes are living and changing, having been translated and mistranslated both during and after Mao's lifetime and on their journeys within and without China. As the People's Republic of China is reasserting its global ambitions for the first time since the Mao era, the imperative to understand the political legacy that unifies the country becomes ever more urgent. But there is also a pressing need to evaluate the power and appeal of Maoism beyond China, where it has enjoyed a long afterlife in revolutionary movements based on Mao's theories of class struggle and guerrilla warfare. Maoism contains within it ideas that have exerted an extraordinary tenacity and ability to travel, that have put down roots in terrains culturally and geographically far removed from that of China. The tea plantations of northern India, the Sierras of the Andes, Paris's 5th arrondissement, the fields of Tanzania, the rice paddies of Cambodia, and the terraces of Brixton. My book is a history both of this Chinese movement and its global legacies, its analyses. It analyzes Maoism's ambivalent history and enduring appeal to power-hungry dreamers and to dispossessed rebels all over the world. Yet global Maoism remains one of the missed or misunderstood stories of the 20th and 21st centuries. One has only to compare the quantities of books about Hitler and Stalin and their international consequences with the lack of studies that synthesize and explain the legacies of Maoism throughout the world. Why do we tend not to see Maoism globally? Why does this book not really exist? Since the 1980s, readers in the European languages, and especially English, that dominate international publishing have been able to access dozens of eyewitness accounts of Mao-era China in the form of memoirs written by victims of the Cultural Revolution. These present a compelling narrative of horror, of violence, and persecution stemming from Mao's abuse of his personality cult and of mindless xenophobia. The dramatic contrast between our picture of a dysfunctional, disastrous Mao's China drawn from these works on the one hand, and of contemporary China, a land of functional state-building and pragmatic consumerism on the other, seems to signal that Maoism has been relegated to the dustbin of history. Kitsch enhances the sense of detachment. Even when a broad swath of Western readers now equate Mao with Stalin or Hitler for the destructiveness of his policies, tourists in China snap up red vinyl-covered copies of the Little Red Book or Mao-emblazoned lighters playing the Maoist anthem, "The East is Red." Visitors to contemporary Germany would not dream of buying copies of Mein Kampf or novelty alarm clocks depicting Hitler Youth performing the Nazi salute. Joke books for British children blithely crack lame puns. Question: who was the most powerful cat in China? Answer: Chairman Meow. Again, an analogous joke built around Stalin or Hitler is unthinkable. All this suggests that to Western eyes, Mao has been safely consigned to the, quote, past, with no risk that his ideas or errors will make a comeback. So much about communism, and especially about communism during the era of high Maoism in the 1960s and 70s, now seems alien and superannuated, not least its doctrinal dialects and acronyms, to cite just a handful of West German Maoist groupuscles from this epoch: the MLPD, the KBW, KPD, Marxist-Leninists, KABD. But the truth is that many of the ongoing tragedies of underdevelopment and conflict that trouble Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East today are hangovers from conflicts in which the Cold War superpowers, the U.S., the USSR, and Mao's China, were once enmeshed, and Maoist ideology helped shape the Cold War in these regions. Yet the sidelining of global Maoism is not only down to our own inattention. It is also a consequence of post-Mao China's success in communicating a particular narrative of its past. In 1978, Mao's successor Deng Xiaoping told the world that China would, quote, never seek hegemony, end quote, and almost every foreign policy PR campaign since then has been devoted to arguing China's status as victim, not activist or aggressor in international politics. For the past 10 years, as China has ascended to superpower status, its rulers have advanced the theory of China's, quote, peaceful rise, end quote, insisting that its new strength and influence will be a force for international harmony rather than militant nationalism. The writing of history is an important corroborating part of this narrative. Government publicity repeats that China has never interfered in the sovereign affairs of other countries. The idea of a virtuously neutral China thus contrasts with the actions of the hawkish West. Modern China's own history of victimization by imperialist nations between 1839 and 1945 encourages sympathy with this view. The Chinese Communist Party's latest campaign for global influence is the, quote, China Dream, designed to market internationally the idea of a strong, successful China. Its book-length manifesto argues that, quote, China has a tradition of cherishing peace and harmony, and it never seeks to pillage others or establish spheres of influence, end quote. When I was researching my first book tracing post-Mao China's obsession with winning a Nobel Prize in literature, I encountered over and over in documents and interviews a great wall of denial that China had any kind of contact with the outside world between 1949 and 1976. In the received wisdom of the 1990s and 2000s, the People's Republic of China made its first grand entrance to the international world in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping took supreme power. Mao-era China therefore had no foreign policy. This version of history upholds it was isolated by and from the international community. Under these circumstances, China does not want to illuminate its desire for leadership of the world revolution during the Maoist period, a time when it exported not only ideology in the form of hundreds of millions of copies of the Little Red Book, but also harder currencies of revolution, money, weapons, and training for global insurgencies, especially in the developing world. Naturally, the story of the CIA or KGB interference abroad is no more edifying, but at least the history is better known. A senior Chinese diplomat historian has expressed the embarrassment that this stretch of the past causes China's contemporary rulers. Quote, the CCP today doesn't want people to talk about this history, ... Their interference in foreign countries back then was truly excessive, end quote. Finally, the intensity with which the contemporary PRC yearns for global influence. It is an irony that memory of the period during which China enjoyed arguably its greatest global soft power in its entire recorded history has to be, quote, disappeared for political reasons. The party's treatment of this issue exemplifies the inconsistencies of Chinese politics today. The contemporary party state, which owes its legitimacy and political stability to Mao, yearns for international, quote, face. Yet because the history and legacy of the Mao era, and especially the Cultural Revolution, the principal motor of global Maoism, were so unstable, and the contemporary Communist Party of China fetishizes political and economic stability above any other governmental goal, the same party state refuses ownership of the global influence that this era ceded, including contemporary Maoist movements in India and Nepal. Due to the delicacy of these questions in contemporary China, many historical materialists remain out of reach. In an archival release unprecedented in communist history, China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, MFA, began opening its 1949 to 65 archives to researchers in 2003. Never before had a communist state declassified the papers of a government department while still in power. But this partial opening stopped short of the crucial Cultural Revolution years, and most of the MFA materials were reclassified in 2012 to 2013 during an IT, quote, systems upgrade, end quote. In any case, the two most important organizations handling the export of Chinese revolutionary theory and practice were the International Liaison Department, ILD, or Zhang Lianbu, and Military Intelligence. The former handled party-to-party relations and therefore dealt with ambitious communist groups posing varying levels of threat to their governments in, say, Burma, Cambodia, Malaysia, France, West Germany, Peru, and elsewhere. Within China, the organization was and remains so secretive that knowledge of its exact location from the 1950s to the 1970s is apparently still not in the public domain. Needless to say, there is no prospect of either organization opening its archives, unless the Communist Party of China itself falls from power. As a result, global Maoism is not an easy subject to research. There is no unified archive for the topic, and primary sources are scattered across speeches, telegrams, and minutes of meetings, many of which remain classified, as well as memoirs and oral histories in a wide variety of languages. The sensitivity of the topic within China has further intensified with the accession to power of Xi Jinping, son of a first-generation revolutionary leader, Xi Zhongxun. Since Xi owes much of his own political prestige to the sanctity of the revolution's image, it has become more important than ever to bury any embarrassing historical details from the Mao era, and particularly those that contradict the doctrine of Chinese non-interference in foreign affairs. The perception of Maoism as a system of ideas and practices relevant only to China has also kept it on the edges of global history. General histories of the Cold War have often underestimated the importance of Maoist China as offering a genuine alternative to Soviet communism, providing intellectual and practical support to rebels throughout the world. Recent scholarship has increasingly acknowledged the Asian and specifically Chinese influence. Odd Arna Westad's Two Important Histories of the Cold War Since 2005 have globalized study of this conflict. A cohort of excellent historians inside and outside China, Westad, Chen Jian, Li Danhui, Lorenz Luti, Sergei Radchenko, Shen Zhihua, Yang Kuisong, Yafeng Xia, took advantage of widening PRC declassification through the 2000s before the clawback began in 2011. But it is still the case that, perhaps stemming from a more general neglect beyond specialists of the global role of China in the 20th century, Maoist China's influence on the radical political upsurge during the 1960s and 70s remains curiously sidelined in Anglophone histories of the period. There is, for example, no English-language book on the spread and impact of Maoist ideas in either post-war Italy or West Germany. There is certainly no synoptic, detailed history of China's involvement in a wide range of conflict and unrest erupting since the Second World War in Asia, Africa, Americas, Europe, and the Middle East. The Pentagonic Moscow, Berlin, Prague, London, Washington plots in John Le Carré's novels urged Anglophone readers to think of the great crises of the Cold War as overwhelmingly American, Soviet, and European stories. But this is not how it looked in the 1960s and 1970s, when territories across Asia seemed set to topple before Chinese communism's message of militant rebellion, and when European, American, and Australian politicians accused China of a, quote, program for Maoist world domination, end quote, reminiscent, quote, of Mein Kampf, end quote, of leading a, quote, worldwide subversive movement, in Latin America, in Africa, and Asia, end quote. quote, should Australia fall, end quote, one Antipodean commentator phlegmatically remarked, quote, historians will not pause to reflect too deeply on the fate of this handful of white men who thought they could live under the shadow of the Chinese phallus, end quote. The stilted international voice of China, the Beijing-published magazine Peking Review, encouraged this sense of alarm in editions across dozens of languages. Quote, Chairman Mao, ... is the great leader of the revolutionary people of the world, lighting the hearts of the revolutionary people of the world and indicating the road to victory in the revolution, end quote. Internal documents reported Mao proclaiming that, quote, China is not only the political center of world revolution, it must also be the center of world revolution militarily and technically, end quote. Westerners and Soviets alike quailed at Mao's breezy arithmetic concerning the possible outcome of a nuclear war. Quote, if the worst came to the worst and half of mankind died, the other half would remain, while imperialism would be razed to the ground and the whole world would become socialist. Without taking China into account, it is impossible to understand U.S. actions during the Cold War in Asia, where American presidents created and propped up states to stem Mao. The publication of the Pentagon Papers in 1971 revealed that America's war in Vietnam was not, quote, to help a friend, end quote, South Vietnam, but to, quote, contain China, end quote. Looking afresh at the global role of Mao's China also helps us reconsider one of the defining analyses of the Cold War in Asia, Washington's, quote, domino theory, the logic of which dictated U.S. political and military intervention in Southeast Asia. For good reasons, analysts since at least the 1970s have been intensively critical of this set of assumptions, for it led to the enormities committed by the U.S. Army in Vietnam between 1965 and 1973, and to overt and covert operations that destabilized newly independent nations and facilitated or propped up dictatorships, for example, in Indonesia, Burma, and Cambodia. Intellectually, also, the idea of the domino theory is unsatisfying because it suggests that the diverse states of Southeast Asia were helplessly passive actors before the subversion of Mao's China. But understandable moral revulsion at and rejection of U.S. foreign policy results of the U.S. foreign policy results of the domino theory have helped foster a neglect, particularly since the 1980s, of Mao-era China's influence on Cold War Southeast Asia. This book suggests revisiting and reworking these ideas. It argues that the domino theory did have some purchase on reality, that Mao and his lieutenants did want to spread their blueprint for revolution through Southeast Asia and beyond. Almost every country in the region, Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaya/Malaysia, Cambodia, and Burma, had strong, capable communist movements, often predating the founding of the PRC, influenced and for the most part materially supported by Mao's China after 1949. For these countries had long suffered at the hands of colonial extractive regimes, little surprise that first Lenin's and then Mao's militant attacks on imperialism appealed to some of Southeast Asia's brightest minds. Without a huge influx of British and then American material and boots on the ground, it is far from clear that the local opponents of communism in Southeast Asia would have been able to withstand these insurgencies in the ways they did, if at all. Studying the global travels of Maoism requires us not only to reconsider this set of ideas from the perspective of a recent ideological past when the doctrines of communism governed and mattered to vast swaths of humanity, but also to think our way into very different geographical vantage points. For many growing up in the developing world between the 1950s and 1970s, Mao-era China did not and still does not represent a basket case, but rather an admirable independent alternative to the political models of the US and USSR. It provided an example of a poor agrarian country persecuted by Western or Japanese expansionism, standing up for itself in the world. In Nepal today, many ordinary consumers idealize China as an economic paradise and believe it is so prosperous because not in spite of Mao. From Paris to Phnom Penh, I don't know if I'm saying that right, from Beijing to Berlin, from Lima to London, from Dar es Salaam to Derby, Mao offered not only rhetorical defiance, but also practical strategies for empowering impoverished states marginalized or dominated by global powers, for training low-tech peasant insurgencies against state-funded colonial militaries. During and after the Cold War, Maoism exercised a particular attraction for underdeveloped, colonized, or recently decolonized states such as Tanzania, Nepal, India, Cambodia, and Indonesia, which at least superficially seemed to resemble pre-1949 China. It exercised this appeal often without much material aid from the PRC, certainly in comparison with the budget dispensed by the Soviet-sponsored Comintern through the 1920s and 30s. In true guerrilla style, Mao's ideas and sayings have captivated the developed world too, percolating through the best French arrondissements and elite U.S. campuses, quote, dig deep tunnels, store grain everywhere, end quote, declaimed radical Harvard students in the 1970s. Maoism has also taken root in parts of the developing world that bear no solid resemblance to the pre-revolutionary China, such as Peru. Without a proper understanding of Maoism's global appeal and travels, it is hard to make sense of events as geographically and chronologically disparate as the Malayan emergency, the 1965 massacres in Indonesia, the cultural revolutions of Western Europe and the U.S. of 1968, the Vietnam War and the Khmer Rouge genocide, and the end of white rule in southern Rhodesia and the rise of Robert Mugabe's ZANU, Shining Path's insurgency in Peru, the civil war in Nepal that ended centuries of monarchy and contemporary insurrection in India's jungles. Conflicts and crises influenced by Mao are not only major historical events, several are still with us in India, Nepal, Peru, and Zimbabwe. Mao's own internationalism is worth a book in itself for what it tells us about the variousness, not homogeneity of PRC foreign policy. Mao combined dreams of world revolution with nationalist ambition and a Chinese imperialism of much older vintage. He veered between imperious acquisitiveness, reasserting Imperial China's claims over parts of the Soviet Union, and free-handed generosity to, quote, fraternal parties whom he saw as part of a Sino/Mao-centric civilization. He carelessly gifted strips of the Sino-Korean border to his, quote, fraternal ally, end quote, Kim Il-sung, and promised when meeting members of the radical pro-China Indian Communist Party to make over to a future communist Indian government all the border territory that India and China bloodily disputed through the 1960s. Mao's lofty socialist solidarity and massive financial aid to Vietnam was tinged with domineering imperialism. 2 years after his death, Sino-Vietnamese tensions escalated into a vile border war. Mao was steeped in an older Middle Kingdom mentality. In attempting leadership of the global revolution, he also wanted to reassert China's claims to occupy the center of the world. Emphasis on China's global mission had an important role to play at home, too. As the headquarters of the revolution, Mao argued, China was peculiarly vulnerable to attack by the reactionary world. He harped constantly on China's international insecurity to mobilize domestic campaigns against potential opponents who were attacked as, quote, spies and, quote, enemies of the revolutionary masses, unquote. Many of global Maoism's actual consequences were unintended. For example, Mao-era China threw money, time, and expertise at Africa in the hope of winning sympathy for and converts to its political cause, but not one lookalike. Maoist regimes took power. Not one lookalike Maoist regime took power. There was only piecemeal uptake of Mao's strategy and symbols in Tanzania and southern Rhodesia, home to his most fervent African admirers. In Nepal, India, and Peru, by contrast, the PRC's investment was more muted. Glossy magazines, translations in radio and local languages, and the occasional invitation to China, little more. Yet in those countries, Mao's ideas found passionate adherents who deployed his strategies in wars and transformed their country's contemporary history. The story of global Maoism exemplifies the unpredictable course of Communist China's ongoing quest for soft power. However closely the party state has tried to mold and direct its global image, its initiatives forever spin off in unexpected, uncontrollable directions. For Maoism is an unstable political creed that simultaneously reveres a centralized party and mass leadership, collective obedience, and anti-state rebellion. In its global journeys, Maoism has served causes that questioned or attacked existing governments. In its country of origin, it has created an omnipresent party state. It has liaison peasant revolution while winning many of its followers or sympathizers from educated elites, such as Louis Althusser, Jean-Paul Sartre, Michel Foucault, Bahram Batarai, or Batarai, Abimael Guzmán. It has been a revolution spread through books. Cerebral global Maoists have often turned the idealized, quote, masses into cannon fodder for their doctrinal revolutions, combining sympathy with brutality towards those suffering at the bottom of society. The close of the Cold War, with its disintegration of old U.S. and Soviet alliances and the rise of ever more fluid global cultures of travel and transmission, has, if anything, only strengthened the validity of Mao's guerrilla tactics and strategies. Analysts of Daesh claim that the group came to power by deploying Mao's ideas about asymmetric warfare against an established state. There is certainly a paper trail of influence from Cultural Revolution doctrines of, quote, People's War to insurgencies in the Middle East. China gave the PLO, in the words of one satisfied Palestinian visitor, quote, everything that we asked for, end quote. And several Palestinian militants made the transition from Maoism to jihadism in the 1980s. Moreover, once you write Maoism back into the global history of the 20th century, you start to get a very different narrative from the standard one in which the Soviet Union loses the Cold War to neoliberalism. A quarter of a century since communism collapsed in Europe and then in the USSR, China's Communist Party continues seemingly to flourish. Under its direction, China has become a world economic and political force. The Communist Party of China, its practice and legitimacy still dominated by Mao, has, with quite extraordinary success, recast itself as a champion of the market economy while remaining an essentially secretive Leninist organization. If the Communist Party of China is still in charge in 2024, the Chinese Communist Revolution will have exceeded the 74-year lifespan of its Soviet brother. China's leaders feel a nervous pride at this prospect. The causes of the Soviet collapse of 1991 fascinate past and present members of the Politburo. If the CCP survives much beyond this point, historians may come to see October 1949 rather than October 1917 as the game-changing revolution of the last century. Study of the history and fallout of global Maoism holds lessons highly relevant to contemporary challenges across the world. This book argues that exploring global Maoism is vital to comprehending not only Chinese history but also radical politics in many parts of the globe, the politics of disenfranchisement, discontent, and impoverishment. In India today, the Maoist Naxalite movement recruits most strongly from the least privileged members of society. Maoism became an international force in the era of decolonization. In the developing world, its message of anti-imperialist confrontation appealed to peoples who had been repressed economically, politically, and culturally, who aspired to the living standards of the industrialized West and to international dignity. Although the Cold War has ended, problems of poverty and inequality persist. As Europe contends with a migration crisis that results from impoverishment and political turmoil, the past and present of global Maoism are important reminders of the radicalism that can spring from material and political desperation and of its consequences. Over the last 2 years, the election of Donald Trump and the rise of European populist politics have brought questions of sovereignty under new scrutiny. In the UK, for example, does it reside with the, quote, people, unquote, as a demagogue like Nigel Farage argues, or with the Parliament? What is the relationship between the, quote, will of the people and the specialist elite who legislate in the capital? These are questions with which Maoism has grappled, often with violent results, in its oscillations between, quote, democratic centralism, Lenin's veneration of an all-powerful secretive party core, the, quote, mass line, Mao's proposition that grassroots ideas should shape party policy, and the, quote, mass democracy, end quote, manipulated in reality by the party-authored call of Mao of the Cultural Revolution. In theory, Mao and Maoism agitated to give voice to the marginalized and to prevent the inevitable flow of power to technocratic metropolitan elites, though the reality has been very different. Intriguingly, the rebellious repertoires of Leninism and Maoism seem to appeal to the architects of Trump politics. Steve Bannon sees himself as a, quote, czar of agitation, end quote. as in his own words, a Leninist plotting to bring the political system crashing down. The Australian sinologist Jeremy Barmay has compared Trump, the, quote, great disruptor, unquote, with Mao for his erratic populism, his scorn for the bureaucratic establishment, his predilection for brief earthly statements, albeit in early morning tweets rather than compendia of quotations, his rhetorical obsession with national autarky. In a development emblematic of the U.S. alt-right's political confusion and the ductility of Maoism, Trump's administration was roiled by yet more turmoil in August 2017 when a paranoid memo circulating around Trump supporters in the National Security Council was leaked to the press. It described a, quote, deep state conspiracy against the president conducted according to the strategies and tactics of the, quote, Maoist insurgency model, end quote. The history of global Maoism also offers important but neglected case studies of radicalization, one of the preoccupations of contemporary sociology. The analytical literature on this subject currently focuses almost exclusively on religion, especially Islam, overlooking examples of Maoist-inspired political violence and indoctrination in Southeast Asia, Western Europe, and Latin America. The recent jailing in the UK of Arandan Balakrishnan, leader of a Brixton Maoist party of the 1970s, for, quote, brainwashing and holding captive for decades several women, reminds us forcefully and close to home of the potency of such indoctrination. Veteran radicals in the FBI's watch list during the War on Terror were, back in the 1960s and 1970s, adherents of Maoist-inflected groups. Their opposition to the American government was forged through engagement with Maoism. International rebels still with us today learned their subversion from Maoist texts. At the other end of the political spectrum, the U.S. Army remains hung up on Maoist military strategy, which is still the textbook model of insurgency to be tackled in their counterinsurgency manuals. Although radicalization by political ideology, especially communist ideology, has come to seem old hat in the post-Cold War world, it is similar in process to radicalization by religion, in its deployment of close-tie relationships to gain recruits, its use of simple, confident explanations, and its exploitation of socioeconomic crises. Indeed, the global history of Maoism inside and outside China is notable for the religious overtones of its leadership cults. In China, Mao was depicted as the sun illuminating his people, who performed their veneration through loyalty dances. Peru's Mao, Abimael Guzmán, a.k.a. Gonzalo, his nom de guerre, was also outlined in golden effulgence on Shining Path posters, and cadres compelled peasants under their rule to exclaim, quote, a Gonzalo, unquote, instead of, quote, a Jesus, or a Jesus, unquote. The past and ongoing stories of global Maoism pose questions about radicalization that resonate loudly today. What kind of socioeconomic circumstances, belief systems, and social structures incubate political violence? What happens to such programs as they struggle for and capture power? How can societies battered by insurgency and counterinsurgency mend themselves? Finally, a note about coverage. This book aims to recount a global history of Maoism, but it is impossible to tell every story. Other examples abound: the Caribbean, Icelandic, Mexican, Swiss Maoists, the Maoism of the Philippine and Burmese Communist parties, the members of the Palestinian Liberation Organization euphemistically hosted in Mao's China on scholarships to study modern Chinese literature. Nor can every episode relevant to this history be told in detail that it demands. The Southern Rhodesian War, Peruvian land reform, Indonesian independence, second-wave feminism, the West German Green Movement will only be sketched in outline. Neither is this a linear biography of Mao and of his impact on China. Although both stories weave in and out of the book's pages, I've tried to select episodes that evoke the trajectory, the variety, and what seemed to me the most significant. That noise just fucking scared me. Might have been the wind. Neither is this a linear biography of Mao and of his impact on China, although both stories weave in and out of the book's pages. I have tried to select episodes that evoke the trajectory, the variety, and what seemed to me the most significant afterlives of global Maoism. As I researched and wrote, I was unable to find a book that juxtaposes these histories to give a unified sense of their diversity and significance. This is an attempt to fill that space. My story of international Maoism begins, like so many extraordinary stories of modern Asia in 1930s Shanghai, an interlocking world of gangsters, revolutionaries, intellectuals, and society hostesses. In 1936, Song Shengling, the beautiful widow of the first president of the Republic, Sun Yat-sen, sister-in-law of Chiang Kai-shek, the scourge of China's left wing, and preeminent fellow traveler to Mao's communists, introduced Edgar Snow, an ambitious journalist from the American Midwest on the hunt for an international scoop, to an underground network that would escort him to Mao's new headquarters in dusty northwest China. Over the weeks that the Americans spent in the communist base, Mao and his closest lieutenants gave Snow a world exclusive, immersing him in a doctored account of their past and present that photoshopped the violence and purges, and portrayed them as persecuted patriots and Democrats. At the end of his stay in the Northwest, Snow had 20,000 words of transcribed interviews, all checked and corrected by Mao. Mao and his comrades had chosen their man well. Snow, a non-communist foreigner with impeccable media connections, was the ideal mouthpiece for taking their story to the international world. The book, Red Star, turned Mao into a political leader with global name recognition. Its Chinese edition won educated young urbanites over to Mao's revolution at a time when Chinese communism was on the point of annihilation. Since 1937, the book has created rebels and guerrillas from the jungles of Malaysia to the freezing fields of West Russia, from the alternative lifestyles of West Germany's 1960s counterculture to the training camps of high-caste Nepali Maoists. I move chronologically through the political, diplomatic, and cultural history of international Maoism, through the lives, texts, and material objects The lives, text, and material objects. The Red Star over China, the Little Red Book, in its dozens of languages and translations, rubbery pink 45s of The East is Red, that communicated the Maoist credo across China and the globe. Ranging between the 1930s and the 1930s and the present day, the pages of this book are peopled by politicians, professors, poets, revolutionaries, translators, misfits, Machiavels, fanatics, and flakes, some of whom ended up ruling one of the largest, most powerful countries in the world. Communism presents itself as an impersonal political science, demanding that the individual submit to abstract ideological authority. Yet the story of Mao's global travels is full of human drama. It is challenging to find anyone less socially conformist than Mao himself, a rebel who hated his father, who aged 34 declared war on the Chinese state, who serially philandered, who wore patched pajamas to state functions, and regularly dragged both Chinese and foreign leaders to audiences with him in the earliest hours of the morning, who purged often to death most of his closest comrades, who refused to brush his teeth ever. The ranks of Mao's acolytes and imitators are filled with similar eccentrics and misfits. The brother of a Mumbai ice cream magnate, who trained as an accountant before declaring war on the Indian state, a Colombian armchair guerrilla who chose whiskey over the revolution, a Peruvian philosophy professor who adored Beethoven alongside Mao, a future president of that renowned bureaucracy of the European Union. Maoism, with its preaching of, quote, protracted warfare, seems particularly suited to oddballs, to those determined both to set themselves in conflict with society and to control it. I will describe the apocalyptic fears of the early Cold War, when China's 1950 treaty with the Soviet Union sent shivers up the spines of Western governments. The alliance was, Odd Arna Vested, I don't know how to say this person's name, has written, quote, "The greatest power to challenge the political supremacy of the Western capital since the final expansion of the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century." Quote. Yet a decade later, China's potentially world-dominating friendship with the USSR unraveled at speed. Denouncing the Soviets as, quote, revisionist, anxious to appease the Americans, Mao and his lieutenants seized every opportunity to sledge the USSR in public and to assert themselves as the true leaders of the world revolution. Maoism's travels through the 1960s and 1970s, the decade in which Mao bid for supremacy and global communism, are the centerpiece of the book. I will track the conflagration of Mao fever, the Mao badges that seeped through China's borders to Nepal, India, and Cambodia, becoming radical chic among Kathmandu, Kolkata, and Phnom Penh youth, the well-thumbed issues of Peking Review declaring Mao, quote, the great helmsman of the world revolution, end quote, and the, quote, never-setting sun, end quote, the crackling nasal broadcast of Peking radio beamed into the African savannah. The Americans and Europeans who worshipped Mao's China from afar, hippies, civil rights campaigners, philosophers, terrorists, and Shirley MacLaine. Maoism had an important place in the hot conflicts of the Cold War, mixed up in communist movements in Indonesia, Cambodia, and Vietnam, movements that transformed the destinies of these countries. To the Vietnamese communists, Maoist China supplied moral and material support. It schooled Pol Pot, and gave him over $1 billion in aid, free military assistance, and medical checkups. On the brink of committing genocide, Pol lounged by Mao's swimming pool as the moribund chairman lauded the Cambodians' emptying of the country's cities into forced labor projects and killing fields. Quote, your experience is better than ours, ... you are basically right, end quote. The final chapters will describe Maoism's long, bloody afterlives in Peru, Nepal, and India, with their confused mix of empathy for and ruthlessness towards those who suffer at the bottom of their societies. In 1996, only 4 years after Abimael Guzmán was captured directing his revolution from a respectable barrio of Lima, Nepalese Maoists declared a, quote, people's war trained by the resurgent Indian Naxalites on the government's long-term systematic neglect of the country's rural majority. By the close of the conflict in 2006, some of 17,000 Nepalese had died. In an ironic twist, the Nepalese borrowing of Mao's tactics of guerrilla warfare has been not only a security threat but also a source of intense embarrassment to China's contemporary rulers, who claim that Mao's ideas have been grossly misinterpreted. Far more than a Cold War aftershock, India and Nepali Maoism are part of the current inflammation of global radicalization. The conflagration of Maoism across South Asia raises fundamental questions about development, social justice, environmentalism, and international exploitation. The story concludes as it begins in China. Even as it strives to suppress memory of Mao's chaotic cultural revolution, the government revives Mao-era songs, films, and language in an attempt to generate nostalgic affection for a regime that has long become more capitalist than communist. Angry young men denounce the profiteering compradors of the current Communist Party and call for a return to Mao's radical egalitarianism. Laid-off workers waving little red books demonstrate against their fat cat bosses. In villages up and down the country, farmers battle with knives, bricks, and sticks their corrupt local officials. They are all heirs to Mao's strange legacy of party discipline, political puritanism, and people's war. To understand the volatile legacy that is still shaping political practice today, we need to track the history of Maoism in China, but also its uses and reinterpretations far beyond China's borders. And that's the end of the introduction to Maoism, A Global History by Julia Lovell. Thank you so much for listening.